So we've walked through some basic types like strings and numbers in TypeScript. Let's take a look at how we can work with arrays in TypeScript, then understand how we can use tuples to add another layer of security to our list of items. Here is how we could declare a basic array of strings in TypeScript. You may also see arrays declared like this in the highlighted line. There isn't any difference between the two, it's more of a syntactical preference. For this course, however, we're going to be going with the highlighted syntax in the top line. In this example, we've given our array of strings value the type of an array of strings. That's what the colon with the open closed square bracket indicates. This type tells TypeScript that our array must only contain strings. That means that if we put a Boolean value in there or a numerical value in there, TypeScript would fail when it came to compiling it and would throw an error. So now that we know how to declare an array of strings, let's take a look at how we could declare an array of numbers. As you can see, it's remarkably similar. We've just changed the type from string to number and kept those square brackets in exactly the same place. It's very likely that you'll encounter a situation where you'll want an array which is filled with more than one type, say for example, an array of strings and numbers. To do that, we can use union types that we've covered in a previous session. Let's take a look on how we could do that. As you can see, we encapsulate our union type in parentheses and follow it with an open and closed square bracket. This indicates to TypeScript that our array can contain numbers or strings. Okay, so you may run into cases where you might want to restrict the amount of items inside of an array. For that, we can use something called tuples. Here's a typical tuple declared in TypeScript. As you can see, a tuple is very similar to an array, except we have a little bit more control over what the contents are. Here, we are indicating that our tuple can only contain two values, which is a string followed immediately by a number. A tuple isn't limited to just having two items in it. A tuple can have any number of items inside of it. Here's an example of a tuple with 5 items in it, all following a specific order. We've got a string, a number, a string, a number, and a string. If any of these elements inside of the array don't follow that pattern, then TypeScript would not compile this and it would throw an error when you were building. Okay, that was a basic introduction into how we can use arrays and tuples in TypeScript. Let's take a look at a more detailed example in the editor. Okay, so in this exercise, we're going to be running through arrays and tuples. So to get started, I'm once again going to create a new file. This one's going to be called arrays_tuples.ts, and then I'm going to hit save. And now before continuing, I'm going to change shirt. I'm going to hit Command and J, and I'm going to type yarn tsc-w so that I can watch my scripts. And to get started, I'm just going to declare a basic array of strings. So array of strings, and the type is going to be an array of strings. I'm also going to disable ESLint just like I did before, and that can be done with that line on line number 1 just there. All right, so if we wanted to fetch the first item from the array, we could do that by going const first item in array, go array of strings, and query the 0 index. So I've manually defined this array to be an array of strings. So let's see what happens if I try and push an array. Let's see what happens if I try and push a number into our array of strings. So I'm going to go push and number 1. And straight away, TypeScript returns an error which says argument of type 1 is not assignable to the parameter of type string, which means that our type definition is working. But let's say, for example, we don't want this to be an array of strings. We actually want this to be an array of strings or numbers. How would we do that? Well, we can use something called union types. And a union type is, simply put, it can be we're basically saying to the compiler that the type can be either type A or type B, which is really helpful when we have arrays, because there are going to be a lot of situations which we're going to come up to where we're going to want arrays that are filled with lots of different types. So how do we create a union? Good news is it's fairly simple. Let's update our array of strings to be called array of strings and numbers. And I'm just going to update them all everywhere else as well. And so to define this as an array of strings or numbers, we want to add parentheses around the type of our array contents, which at the moment is just string. And then I'm going to add a singular pipe after the string and then add the other type that we want the array to contain. So I'm going to add number and hit save. And now that we've defined that this array is an array of strings and numbers with that union type, we've now satisfied TypeScript and there are no more errors. All right, I'm going to add a nice little comment at the top just so that we can define our arrays, because we're about to move on to tuples, which is very, very similar, but with some slight differences. So let's define a tuple which is going to consist of a string and a number. So const string and a number, nice and descriptive. And let's type it. So let's explicitly declare the type. I'm going to open and close a bracket straight away. And I'm going to type in string, followed by number. I'm going to just open and close some square brackets there. And straight away, we've got an error in our TypeScript log. You can ignore that for the time being. Let's just focus on the type for the time being. So where this differs from an array is we have stipulated that we want the first item in this array of 2 items to be a string, and we want the second one to be a number, which means that this array cannot have 1 item in it, it can't have 0 items in it, it has to have 2 items, and the first one must be a string and the second one must be a number. And we can extend this as long as we want. It doesn't just have to be 2 items, it could be string, number, string, number, string, number. And now we have now we would have a tuple which requires 6 values to be inside of it, and it would need to be a string, number, string, number, string, number in that order. All right, let's go back to just the string and the number. We don't need all these additional strings and numbers in our tuple right now. And let's review the error that we've got in our TypeScript log here. So we've got type open and close square bracket, which is an empty array, is missing the following properties from the type, string, and number. Now that should be fairly simple to understand because we have fed it an empty array. So let's fill it with the values that we've defined in our type. So here's a string, and then the number can be 500. I'm going to hit save. And straight away our error disappears. Let's change this 500 to another string and see what happens. And an error comes up, but this time it's specifically honed in on this second argument as the cause of the problem. When we highlight it, it says type string is not assignable to type number because we have defined that the second parameter in our tuple is a number, or should be a number. So let's set that back to 500 and hit save, and we're all good again. Now, much like arrays, and this is kind of where the similarities come back in, if we wanted to take the first item from our tuple, so const first item in tuple, we would query it in the same way that we would work with an array. So we can go string and number 0. And when we hover over that, our type is defined as a string because we have explicitly said that the first item in our tuple will always be a string. So this is a perfect example on both the first item in the array and the first item in tuple of the TypeScript inference system working again. As you can see when we hover over the first item in the array, because we defined the array to contain strings and strings or numbers, when we hover over it, we've got our union type, which is which is a string or number. And when we hover over the first item in the tuple, it is explicitly a string because the first item in our string and number tuple is defined as a string. If I change that to 1, which would be the second item in our tuple, this should now be a number. All right, so that was a quick crash course into using arrays and tuples in TypeScript. As you can see, they're really, really powerful, but this is sort of just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more that can be done with these, but we'll cover that later on in the series.